Good morning, everyone. Just under 2 years ago, I sat down in a pub in the south of Oxford with a friend and colleague called Frank Partnoy. So we started having a conversation about shareholder activism, and we found ourselves starting to meander because it was a time of very difficult politics, as some of you may know, in both America and also in the UK. And so we started to think about the fracturing of societies, the polarization of politics, and then this question of trust. Trust in institutions and trust in business. And as that conversation flowed, we looked to historical precedents. We wondered if this was the first time that we were seeing this type of fracturing and polarization. And of course, it wasn't the first time. So we thought, how can we understand what's happening today? And we found ourselves focused on the 19th century. And what we discovered as we thought through this mad idea was something very powerful. If you look back at 1847, which is when the manifesto, arguably the most important political discourse of the 19th century, was written. It was actually published 1 year later in 1848, but written over 9 weeks in 1847 by these two gentlemen, Marx and Engels. And the first thing you notice that Marx and Engels were young, 29 and 28. They were also very unlikely authors of such a angry manifesto, such a call for change, because they both came from actually extremely well-off families. But the things that we looked at that were the backdrop to the reason they wrote that manifesto, three things stuck out. The first is that this was an era of technological revolutions. It was 4 years before the Great Exhibition of 1851. It was also the time when the transatlantic cables of telecommunications were being put in place, so big advances in technology. Secondly, there was a huge amount of political problems and turbulence. And then the third was economic uncertainty. There had been a catastrophic financial crash 10 years before, in 1837, and a subsequent panic. Now, we looked at that, and this was, of course, the backdrop where Marx and Engels came up with their famous, now, manifesto, and this concept of inequality, this deep sense that there was an injustice that was being driven by these forces. But when you took a look at what was happening in 2017, the questions and some of these big themes started to sound very similar. If you think about technology, we're in a very, very big period of rapid change. If you think about political uprisings, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Trump, Brexit, and everything else. Can't believe I used the B word, and I normally avoid that. And then the economic uncertainty, again, 10 years ago, there was a crash, and we're still feeling in the Northern Hemisphere the shockwaves from that. And like then, we took a look and felt that actually that the debate about inequality today is just as alive as it would have been back in 1847. Marx and Engels, we think, would have been horrified by the fact that 8 people have more wealth than 3.6 billion of the rest of us today. That's half the planet. Those 8 people have $425 billion of wealth. Now that is inequality on a scale that even Marx and Engels, I think, would have really found problematic. But some other things too also then got us thinking about this question of trusts and the limits of trust, this theme of limitless. The first is that business is having to step up and match the commitments or meet the commitments that governments traditionally have made. And government spending around the world has been on a reduced path since 1940. Last year, the American federal government, the spending dropped below 1.4% of GDP in the second quarter of 2018 for the first time since the 1940s. So government spending is reducing, And companies are expected now to pick up the slack on things that are essentially social provision. And that's a big theme which is putting pressure on businesses and raising big concerns about the question of trust. In addition to that, I think we are living in a really interesting time today in the business world. Because if you think about the dominant managerial ideology for the last 50 years, which was from 1970 onwards, this idea of shareholder value. Milton Friedman's famous 1970 paper that said the only responsibility of managers was to make profits for the owners, and the owners could then decide what they did with it. That's a very, very dominant management theory, and in my professional life, that's been what every chief executive has trotted out time and time and time again, that their responsibility is to their shareholders. That world is coming to a close. And it's a fundamental change in the way in which businesses are now being held to account. But it poses enormous questions and problems for business leaders. Which stakeholders should they think about? How much priority should they give certain stakeholders as opposed to certain others? These are very, very troubling and difficult questions for leaders today. So there's some background. And that poses some big issues around trust. And in particular, I love the theme of limitless because I think trust has a serious set of limits to it. Start with this. This is a schematic, a very simple schematic, which shows you how the mortgage-backed securities market works. But very simply, the bank lends John $150,000 to buy a house. That bank then bundles that mortgage into a packet of other mortgages. It then sells that packet of mortgages onto another financial institution, normally a larger institution, which buys that package and a lot of other packages, puts them together, and then sells mortgage-backed securities on the basis of those assets. That's a sort of 101 for mortgage-backed securities. Now, the interesting thing is that Moodys, which is the principal ratings agency in the US, one of the principal ratings agencies, rated 45,000 of these in 7 years from 2000 to 2007. And more than half of those it rated AAA, the highest rating that you can possibly achieve. Only 6 private sector companies in the US were afforded that AAA rating. So what was happening here? What was happening here was that this business, Moodys, this intermediary, was creating a set of very high-grade ratings for things that ultimately actually weren't worth what they thought they were worth. And the issue, this is where I find the first limit of trust kind of interesting, because a lot of organizations start talking about the need to rebuild trust. If you think about that concept, it seems very strange, because the financial crisis was caused by too much trust, not by too little. We trusted when we shouldn't have trusted. We trusted regulators to regulate properly. We trusted ratings agencies to know what they were rating. And we trusted financial institutions to understand what they were actually selling. And all of that was misplaced trust. So the question to me around the limits of trust start with actually that there was too much, not too little. And when organizations today talk about the need to rebuild trust, I find myself thinking, but that's like mainlining heroin back onto an addict. Okay? You need to think very carefully about earned trust and actually start with a concept of distrust. I think that's a healthier starting point. So this question of trust is sort of problematic. But it's not always the case that trust is not there. We all trust all sorts of people for all sorts of things all the time. If you think about when you post a letter, okay? We say we don't trust the postal service, the hospitals, or banks. And yet, when we post a letter, what are we doing? We're trusting people. We're trusting the service that it'll take that letter and it'll deliver it to where it's intended. When we get ill and we then put ourselves in the hand of a doctor or go to hospital, we're trusting that that person, at one of the most critical, vulnerable moments in our lives, will be able to sort us out. And in banking, all of us trust our banks. We regularly put deposits in, our bank checks go in there, our work checks go in there, and we also trust that the bank will make available our funds through the ATM on a daily basis. So it's not a question that trust doesn't exist. Trust does exist, but it exists in certain individual ways. So this question of trust and the limit of trust has a number of big problems attached to it. And what I intend to just focus on for the remaining 15 minutes is a different approach, something which I think is far more powerful and far more useful. And it's not the question of trust, it's the question of reputation. Reputation is a far more valuable diagnostic frame in which to think about what business needs to do to recover its reputations, not this idea of hard trust. It turns out that there are effectively two lenses through which we all view others. That may be another company, it may be our colleagues, it may be a nation state, it may be an institution. And it's a lovely diagnostic lens. This Janus face of reputation has, the first frame is perceptions of capability. Is this organization able to do what it says on the packet? Does Qantas fly me from A to B? Does the AMP banking group deliver me the financial services products that I want? All of these are capability reputations. Okay? Can VW make good cars? These are perceptions of capability. The second lens is this perception of character, which has got nothing to do with how capable you are, but it's about an assessment of the type of organization that you're seen to be. Now, that's super valuable and important to a number of people. You want to understand how an organization thinks. What type of treatment will I get if I'm a supplier? What type of environment am I going to be getting into if I give my talent and I become an employee? That's more about character than it is about capability. So this double lens of capability and character is super valuable. I'm going to give you some examples just to drive home how valuable I think this is. And I apologize in advance because now that you get this frame, I find that I'm like a boy with a hammer. Everything I see becomes a nail. Okay? And I start analyzing my friends, capability, character. I start analyzing my wife, my children. It doesn't end well. I'm going to ask the audience here just to give me a sense. Okay, so VW with this diesel scandal, the emissions scandal, and the falsification of their records over 9 years. And United, that terrible event where that poor man was dragged off the United airline and then deposited back in the terminal. Would you say that those crises are crises of capability or crises of character? Character. 100% correct. Character is exactly what those are. By contrast, if you think about these two particular examples, Toyota back in 2009 had one of the most damaging to this day incidents that has affected Toyota. It resulted in one of the biggest apologies in Japan ever done by a corporate leader. And it was when an off-duty police officer and his family, driving on the freeway south of San Diego, rang a 911 call. You can still hear it on the internet. It's a terrible call, saying we're traveling fast and faster. We can't slow the car down. The accelerator seems stuck and we can't use the brake. And they ended up crashing into another car and down a bank, and all were killed in 2009. Now, this emerged as being a major braking problem and a massive scandal for Toyota. Equifax, one of the world's largest data companies, last year had a data breach. Capability or character? Capability. Okay, so very clear you can start seeing these type of diagnostic tools being super valuable. Now, that's interesting as far as it goes, but we need to take it one stage further to work out why it matters, okay, why it connects to business. Capability reputations, it turns out, are very sticky. Most of you will have heard Warren Buffett's famous quote that it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 20 minutes to lose it. Well, it's nice to be able to say that you disagree with Warren Buffett, okay? Because actually it turns out that it's not as simple as that. There are plenty of reputations that seem remarkably sticky, okay? BP, for example, is still awarded a number of mandates all over the world for drilling operations. 3 weeks into the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, they were awarded a new contract in the Gulf of Sidra together with Total. Why? Because they're capable. The capability side meant that actually that they were trusted with that type of activity. Okay. Character, by contrast, is extremely volatile. You could be a hero one day and a zero the next. Hero, zero, hero, zero. Okay? So that's the first line observation, and it helps you think about how you respond to the types of crises that you may face. But perhaps the really valuable insight is that it matters to different people. Capability matters to customers. Now, we all might think that we're ethical consumers and that we make principled stances on all sorts of purchasing decisions. The truth is that we're not. We basically like to consume what we want to consume if it feels and tastes and is good, right? That's what, so the capability is undoubtedly the most important thing when it comes to the transaction as a consumer. However, character is of huge value, and it's of huge value to counterparties. Now, by counterparties, we mean investors, regulators, employees, suppliers. All of those think that character is hugely important. Why? Because they're not in a transactional one-off relationship. They're in a relationship that spans multiple interactions. And it turns out that this is hugely valuable as a diagnostic tool. VW, in the year of their scandal, VW, of course, was a character crisis, right? In the year of that scandal, they had their best sales year ever. As customers, they didn't really care. What they wanted was the VW, because the VW still to this day is one of the cheapest to insure, and it's got the highest safety record. I myself bought a car for my son. Any of you with children will know that you arrive at this extraordinarily strange period in your life where, age 19, they pass their driving test, and then you decide to weaponize your child. And so I bought a car for my son, a second-hand car, and all I wanted to know was, if he hits something, is it going to stay roughly intact? Okay, and so the safety rating was absolutely 100% paramount, as was the insurance cost. Those were what mattered to me, not about whether there'd been emissions or not. And this is very valuable for thinking about some of the reputation recovery work which is happening today across many, many organizations. Because actually, when you think about this, a lot of the violations that have happened all over the world with big companies actually are character violations. How an organization goes about its business and thinks about the work. It's also very exciting when you think about the way in which certain organizations are starting to form. We've talked a bit about the emergence of B Corps and new models. I'm fascinated by Patagonia. Patagonia, when you have a look at what they do, this is the front page of their website. If you have a look here, and it's very hard to see anything which is selling you anything. There's no buy this. Right up in the corner there, you've got a little button that says shop. Tiny button. But it's calling itself an activist in corporate form. And it's building a customer profile and a customer connectivity based on a reputational game. This idea that they're building a reputation for being super concerned about some of the societal issues which really do connect with what customers are thinking about. Okay, so they are obviously big on the environment, and I think you're starting to see smart organizations now start to adopt authentic activist positions. And organizations that do that really well are going to be the big winners in the next few years. The work that we're doing at Oxford is centered around this idea that reputation is going to become more valuable than money. It's going to become the currency that defines you. And here's why. Many of you will have seen this and heard this, but this is China's social credit score system. And if you think about what China is doing here, it's created and is using algorithmic AI to score all of its 1.3 billion citizens on 5 rankings, 3 of which are entirely reputational. And they're creating a single number on which everything is going to fall for you as an individual. You'll be able to apply for a Schengen area visa at a certain level. You'll be able to apply for a loan at a different level. If you're in the love business and you're on the Chinese equivalent of Tinder, none of you know what I'm talking about, obviously, but the Chinese equivalent of Tinder, which is called Bai Hei, if you're in that game trying to find love, it turns out that your score will determine whether you're seen first or last. So if you've got a low score, good luck in finding a partner. This is the world of algorithmic reputations, and this is the world that we're entering into. I think it's super exciting and super worrying. It's worrying because there are some very, very big problems with algorithms. You've heard a lot about AI in the last day or two. AI, we spent a lot of time looking at AI systems at the university in Oxford, and it becomes very clear that we all know what goes in terms of information in, and we can see what comes out, but the bit in the middle is this huge question of what we're calling explicability. No one knows what happens inside the algorithm, and that's a massive trust issue. Now, the Department of Justice has a system which is used in, I think, 23 to 25 states, called Compass. And it's a system which judges use to assess the likelihood of reoffending. And they use it for sentencing guidelines. So the offender gets put through the Compass system. If it's a high likelihood that they'll reoffend, they get a higher sentence. If it's a low likelihood of reoffending, they get a lower sentence. And they've used it for 12 or 13 years. Turns out this system is racist. It predicts that more black people will reoffend than do, and more white people will not reoffend who end up reoffending. It's racist. And yet it's been the central determining feature of the sentencing guidelines for 23 states. But, and it's good to end up on a positive note, there is some upside and some positivity around this reputation as currency. I think there's a very exciting question about data. Everyone's talking about data today and about data being the new gold. Well, data is, of course, extremely valuable. And the current debates have been talking about how do you put rules and regulations around what organizations can do with data? How do you put sort of controls and privacies and all of that stuff? I think that feels to me like it's a debate that's never going to be won by anyone. A far more interesting idea is this idea of reputation currency for your data. The idea being this, is that actually you own your data, not anyone else. So why don't you monetize it how you want? Okay? Make it a transparent, transactional thing. It's true. Our data is used, and it's an untransparent transaction. We give our data to Facebook, and they give us their service. But do we know how much our data is worth? No. But we get a free product. All we know is that Facebook is one of the most valuable organizations on the planet. So this idea of data being the new reputation currency is starting to see the emergence of some really exciting new businesses. Data Wallet, my private data wallet, a number of different organizations starting to think about how you can control your data. And it comes back down to this central point that I'm going to leave you with, which is that reputation today, I think, has got the potential to become the currency of the future. Thank you very much.